Wanajmeda Hawa Madalla Sahebu Kumwamangawa Wamayante Kuanil Hawa Indwala Wahyam Yuha Alamahu Shariru Quwa Lumeradan Vastawa Wahuwa Belufiqilala Thumadana Fatadala Fakana Qaba Qawsain Awadna Wauhalam Dehemauha Makadhabal Fuadumara Avarumarunau Alamayara Walaqad Nazlatan Nukra Inda Sidratil Muntaha Inda Jannatul Mawa Idh Yaghsha Sidrata Ma Yaghsha Mazangal Basaru Wamatanga. There are more hadith about the ascent of the 27th of Rajab that year than there are about everything else regarding Prophet Muhammad's life and the situation to which he was born in. Laqan ramin ayatirabel bumra afarai tumlatawal uza wamanatan thalithatalukra. And then the Quraysh, upon the first time that this chapter was said, this was one of the few chapters that was said at full at first, said something to the regards of, and these crones whose intercession is much availed. It was a line that they used to say on pilgrimage, and no one in the right mind, because of what was previously said here and what follows, like Allah kumulakaru walahulunta. And at the end of the chapter, whether people were Muslim or not, they prostrated. And this is the chapter that reminds us that there are no daughters of gods, just like elsewhere we focus on there not being any sons of God. And what sense would it make for the polytheist verses to be officially made part of things when you're asked to consider it, and after it you're like, well, are they, you want males, so why are you saying that God has female offspring? And we hear about the serious thing, Cyrus, God is the provider of Cyrus. Because some people believe that Cyrus was the provider, or there was some sort of separate deity over Cyrus that was the provider. And so it deals with these things. See, and it talks about female names and all this other stuff. It just doesn't make sense. The later claim that, there are verses, there is a place in the Quran that talks, or maybe a couple, that talks about Satan throwing stuff in, but among the traditions of the people. Because there is a tradition that says that a couple people wrote something down and Muhammad said, bring what you've written. And, so they brought what they wrote. It's like, this wasn't part of what I said. And nobody said, we heard it too. Because it was heard as the voice of the people. But these people had written it in their manuscript and they were forbidden from writing the Quran. And it doesn't serve to just ignore, like, the incident is whatever, because people made noise. The Quran talks about people making noise over the recitation. Kind of like that Faith Under Fire show that was going on a couple decades ago, back when that fairness doctrine and all those other shows, people make noise over each other. The point of the company would still come through, and they'd try to make the person look ridiculous. But anyways, we're talking about how Muhammad was of good emotional, mental health. There wasn't anything wrong with him physically. It was part of a wider experience. The Quran, of course, is a part of the wider experience. Even, the light beings, the unfallen angels. You got to make clear what you mean by angel, because jinn and malaika does refer to the whole thing about angels. Now, this next, using the English word, but malaika and jinn are different things. And so the other verse that mentions this, which I'm going to go into next, is, it combines the mention of the vision and the cursed tree. Of course, the cursed tree, we have some of the Kabbalah sequences before the Kabbalah, hundreds of years before anything that you could say was Kabbalah. Now, there was Gnosticism and stuff like this, but it didn't match up with what was later called the Kabbalah, because there was language changes and whatnot. So, but aside from that point, what is our belief about the vision? Because certainly we believe in it. And, I guess there's the verse that starts that chapter, because I want to give a complete view of this, because the commentary, well, not a complete view, we don't have time for that, but, the servant. And in Semitic languages, that word abd, it isn't debasing when you're something, because people, slave, servant, devotee, they don't like that sort of term, but that's sort of their pride. But there's a difference between submitting to the mundane, submitting to the humans and all that, or the social order or whatever, and submitting to ultimate divinity. And so the point was that Muhammad was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem, and he was shown some signs, and people agreed that he was able to tell things that they didn't know yet, because people were on their way. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Subhanalladhi asra bi'amdi laylan minal masjidil haram ilal masjidil aqsa ladhi barakna hawlahu linuriyahu min ayatina innahu huwa samiul basir. And the point was that we believe that Muhammad actually experienced these things. Rather than get into arguments about the semantics of it, he actually experienced these things in a way that was miraculous. وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لَكَ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى بِالنَّاسِ وَمَا جَعَلْنَا الرُّؤْيَا الَّتِي أَرَيْنَاكَ إِلَّا فِتْنَةً لِلنَّاسِ وَالشَّجَرَةَ الْمَلْعُونَةَ في القرآن ونخوفهم فما يزيدهم إلا طغيانا كبيرا. And so the tree, is it like the bit in Surah 77 that kind of like provides like a tree of hell, but then in, going down the tree, you got the left hand, which in the Kabbalah is the one where, well, I mean, you can put charity there, but it's the book and stone. And people say, oh, I want to be the living word. You can't be the living word if you're not doing your best with the obligations as prescribed, the clear universal things. Do you say that the tree is, the Quran talks about the tree with the zaqqum, it's kind of like having a cold. That's not really the best way to say it, but and when I say Muhammad ibn Abdullah, I mean Prophet Muhammad, because people are going to have, you can find other people with the name, particularly in the centuries after Muhammad. Early on, it's thought that at least one person had the name Muhammad before Prophet Muhammad, but this was from, centuries before, actually. But it wasn't like, and it's interesting that John and Jesus come from names that were appearing among the Gnostics. Isu really wasn't a version of Joshua so much as it was a weird pronoun. Oh thou, it's a second person, and but anyways, one of the claims that this is somehow connected to is how the prophet pointed out that Ali was unique in terms that, except for the prophethood part, he was going to be like Aaron was to Moses. And the Quran and all these stories and lessons and stuff, they do refer to us, but let's be real and admit that, it's talking about the prophet first. Like so many of the people nowadays said, maybe they're a prophet in the English sense, but not the Nabiullah, not the Rasulullah, that they have experiences and they think, oh, this directly addresses me. It's like, yeah, it does everybody who hears it, jinn and men. So when it says, oh, prophet and all this other stuff, it's not, it's making clear that it came through another. Just like if you understand the Quranic mode, then you understand a lot of what remains of other scriptures. It's like, this person isn't talking about themselves, they're quoting God. And it's not, oh, if you just follow this, you're going to be the next prophet, or you're going to, somehow like a secret society. You're an accolade, you're a priest, and then you're prophet. It's like, that's not how it works. That's how it works according to some churches, but that's not how it works. But more can be understood. than one thinks. And speaking of names, there's also the aspect of the Sunnah. A lot of people talk about the Sunnah as like, whose Sunnah, whose Hadith. To be very careful. And sometimes it's a sectarian interpretation, and that's fine. And there are some narrations about people doing funeral rites at night, but as a rule, it was only to be done during the day. So they would pray the early or late afternoon prayers, and then they would do the funeral prayers over somebody, and then the person would be buried as such. And aside from believing, we have the aspects of when you hear of the context of the Quran, because let's remember the Quran was part of an experience, and the words were memorized, and some of the context was passed on, both the what people would call the mundane circumstances going on around, because it's supposed to imbibe spiritual importance. Prophecy is absolutely not this thing where you just predict the future. There are some elements that can indicate some of those things, like later in chapter 17, which we shared 2 verses of. Okay, the Israelites rose to power twice and fell twice, and then it happened with Judaism twice. And now we're in the period where Zionism is the thing. And some of these people who are causing some issues, they're labeled as Jews, whether they're usually not Semitic at all, but particularly in the sense of Northern Semitic ancestry in the last 3,000 years, some 90 to 95% of the Jews don't have any. They're converts from Ukrainians and Turks and Russians and stuff. Well, in other parts of the world where Christianity spread and people said, well, the theology of Judaism makes more sense, or there's stuff that I can do as a Jew that they won't let me do as a Christian, and whether it's lawful in Judaism or not, that became a thing. But that's a whole different issue. But and so you got to watch out for people who just take the label. And we got to be careful of the gender references. And, Huwa is gender neutral and it's used for both. It's not some secret name for God like some of the Sufis say. The Sufis probably talk about the ascension more than anybody else. And some people will ask questions like, oh, what was the ant of Solomon? Was it a male or was it a female? And it's like, well, there's reasoning to think that it's not necessarily a female. But can a female speak up and make a point? Yes, a female can speak up and make a point. Islam is unique when it comes to a lot of faiths because somebody makes a mistake in the prayer, the women can speak up and correct it. A mistake in the sermon, and I don't just mean a difference of opinion, they don't say the hadith wrong or they have a question, women can speak up. In general, if you have a question, you don't just, I don't you ask afterwards. I like to talk to the whoever gave the sermon afterwards. And when we give a reply, we should primarily try to say, what does the Quran say? What does, if you actually believe this is what the Prophet said, what is the position there? We have the verse that tells us that, you don't raise your voice over the voice of the Prophet. And, that obviously includes your opinion or what you would say with your voice if you were speaking your opinion. And other people say it's like when you're in Medina where the Prophet's buried, you lower your voice. It's like, well, the masjid is right next door. I mean, they extended the masjid around the grave, and it's like, why didn't they just put him in the regular graveyard? That makes such an issue because people actually go there and pray to Muhammad. Um, Even on Hajj, they destroy their Hajj by doing something that takes them out of Islam. And you know, the sacrifice of that's part of Hajj. A lot of people are going to give the wrong reason for not making it. It's like if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. But that doesn't mean, oh well, I bought the TV package all year. I bought junk food all year, and um, you took extra drives or vacation or something, so you can't um, $40 to $300, I think it would be, to do the sacrifice. Like you can't do that because it's like, no, that's not how it works. Um, Same thing with the zakat. It doesn't become not allowed. Now it has to be Islamically raised, Islamically slaughtered, distributed, um, at least a third to the poor, um, and then you can a third to the gathering that you're feeding, and a third, you can use for yourself. But I think most people nowadays just make it a full-on sacrifice. I mean, it is full-on sacrifice, but you know what I mean. It's all given in charity, and some things were repeated in different ways that the Prophet said in different times. But the point was made clear, and the point was that the Quran was preserved. I think it's a general Sunni doctrine that parts of the Quran were forgotten. The Shia do not. Well, I mean, in general, the Shia do not believe that the Quran was any part of it was forgotten because if you actually look at the Sunni narratives, you don't. There are some weak narrations, you could say, but the Quran does not. There's no reason to think that those things are valid if you look at the language claims and stuff like that. Um, it's what you'd call fabricated narrations, and both the narration itself and you try to compare it to the Quran. Now, it does make clear that there are some things that were revealed to Muhammad that were either lost to tradition or he didn't learn them himself. They served their purpose, and the general point was left. But it doesn't actually say that it's the Quran. So that's a point that would be laid down. And those who are the Imam, the point was that just like what Muhammad told the people, they were people who knew more about the religious matters, and the people would be able to inform them about the worldly matters, so we shouldn't distinguish them. And the prophecies about the revolts and stuff like this, well, they weren't changing the religious law, because obviously, like, people talk about, oh, the apostates and the disbelievers and the blasphemers that were fought. It's like, look at the context of all that. The Quran talks about apostates. One, at the end of Surah 4, people go back and forth and back and forth. It's like, wait a second, if the ideal is to kill them because they've renounced their faith, then they wouldn't get the chance to spend the rest of their life going back and forth whether they were Muslim or not. And earlier in chapter 4, if someone attacks you, it doesn't matter whether they call themselves Muslim or not. If they're attacking someone else, it doesn't matter whether they're called themselves Muslim or not. Outwardly somehow appear to be Muslim. And if they're joining a party that attacks you or something, it doesn't matter if that's what's going on, right? It just doesn't make sense to that. And speaking of sacrifice in terms of charity, let us remember that the beggar who begs for their needs is more exalted than somebody who gives and they are short in paying their required alms, that 40th once a year, the fifth of the spoils of, this, the wars or whatever. The, the four double heaping handfuls of food at the end of Ramadan, the sacrificial animal. If these are all obliged on them, and they fall short, obviously that alone would make the receiver of charity in a higher position, as long as they were, of course, acting upon a need and doing it lawfully, not like some of those Christmas traditions, and down will come butler, ball and all. Marauders would go door to door begging and say, "Oh, you're rich and you have abundance. You should give some of ours." It's like, as a rule, these people, they weren't begging for a need; they were threatening. Halloween, people begged for sweets. Now, some people gave some of the extra fruit and stuff like that, so there was some. But as a rule, people, they went door to door trying to get some sweets, and that's not right. Oh, I'm begging for junk food. It's like, no. And then, of course, the rich who get unlawful things, insurance and more obvious forms of gambling. That's how they're getting their money. If they're getting their money through usury or monopolies where they raise the prices, you don't do that. Your cost may go up or something like that, but you don't. Islam does not allow company leaders to do that. Now, people talk about, Caribbean raiders. It's like, no, if somebody takes your property and owes you something, that's different. Wars that were fought in that regard, they weren't like, oh, well, there's wealth that we want from these people and we're going to raid. No, Islam is not, the same competition of, once you have an enemy that you can go whatever. It was only to get back property that was owed to them, and it's not something that's just done willy-nilly with anyone. Or, like, for example, it's narrated that that a wife or kid or somebody who's one's responsibility, that if you're not providing their needs, then they can take towards their needs. But again, it's not. It has to be needs, or if property was taken by one or something like that. And I'm definitely not saying anything contrary to the idea of following the law of land, because we should follow the law of the land. And we got to be careful when we speak of God that we do not limit things in terms of time and space. I mean, we were talking about the light beings and how we don't limit our ideas and saying that God has literal children. And, we may know some of the light beings through certain forms, you could say, but they don't have gender in the sense that we have gender. That's why we're forbidden to talk about them as females, because in general, in Arabic, we have the neutrals. And when you use the feminine, you're making it not neutral. But then again, is the sun and the moon, are those male and female? That's not really the claim, that they are male and female. And the creation, if we investigate the creation, we will realize our attachment to the Creator. And we can look at the individual species. We can look at stuff that goes on within ourselves. And we think of the people of Aras. Some people say, oh, it's the red-haired people of the north, or the people that had red-haired people among them. The red and the blonde hair, comes from Homo erectus, I think was the group of humans that we get those traits from. But it is agreed that they were Eurasians, because Aban, Azar, D, Bachman, Isfandar, Farwardin, Urdi, Bahisht, Khuzdad, Mardad, Tir, Meher, and Shaharyur. Isfandar was of the central, and they had a central tree planted by Yath bin Nuh. So it's said that their kingdom was after the flood of Noah. Now, was the Black Sea flood is what we seem to be indicating. There was a bottleneck of humanity about 250,000 years ago, and it seems to narrow down to a few. So some of the stories that we have in regards of Noah, and I'm not going to go fully into all this, but but anyways, some of the biblical or Israeli stories kind of blend some things together. There will be a couple verses, and there'll be a whole story behind it. Sometimes as big as some of the smaller books in the Bible. Sometimes you'll hear a reference that this thing in some of the Chronicles or something that you find in the cuneiform tablets are as big as the Hebrew Bible. Well, smaller writing, but you know what I mean. It's the context. As a rule, they're not, but you combine those 74 lost books, but they mix traditions together. So that's why we're supposed to. The Quran calls us to look at the various sciences, the various to make an actual historical investigation rather than just what was claimed by some text of old, which deals with any. People may say, oh, that's that leaves it open-ended, that if there was ever a problem, it's like, yeah, because the evidence doesn't support it. So we're supposed to follow the evidence in our interpretations, and so our investigation into the sciences, history and other such things, as actual science, allows us to continually theorize upon the facts rather than just let things fall because someone who now the Quran says it's fully explained, and for our moral guidance and stuff, yes, the Prophet said enough, but he also promoted this thing where we would continually get the new information. We need to learn what happened with the secular systems of old, the different political systems, how when by themselves they all fail, or any fragmented thing like